Okay, we are live, folks. So thanks for joining us tonight for this. I'm gonna guess it's gonna be a brilliant Q&A. We're with Terry Cook, who's a former Buccaneer nav on the RAF and Royal Navy book, and also Tornado GR1 nav. But yeah, Terry, what's been happening since we last talked? I mean, it's not been that much of a time ago, but what's been happening on your end?
No, not a lot. I've been doing a little bit on helping the current 27 Squadron update its history from my time. I've done a little bit of work on my microlight, changing the one of the two throttle cables, and a fair bit of physiotherapy. I had a knee injury when we spoke up at Yorkshire Museum, but I'm now back playing my pickleball again.
Yes, pickleball. If you haven't watched Terry's interviews, go and check that out because I've never heard of it and it's fascinating. So yeah, but Terry, can you give us a bit of background about your flying career in case people haven't watched the two-part interview?
Yep, I came out of training, completed the Buccaneer OCU, and was offered a slot with 809 Naval Air Squadron on board HMS Ark Royal, which I jumped at. Almost 2 years there. Ark was then decommissioned. I transferred back to the RAF with 16 Squadron at Larbrook. After 3.5 years, I was on the third Tornado Squadron, 27 Squadron at RAF Marham. I guess about 2.5 years there, and then to the Tornado Operational Evaluation Unit, and then back out to Germany as a flight commander on a Tornado Squadron at Bruggen.
Brilliant stuff. So, guys, get your questions coming in the chat there for Terry. But I've got one question. I don't think we really touched on it. I'm sure we can maybe meet up again and talk about it. But what was it like taking the book to Red Flag? If you can just give us a brief overview, because that looked amazing, even from the pictures you sent me.
Yeah, it was exciting. It was great to take the aeroplanes out there. We took them across the Atlantic, unescorted, unaccompanied. We went in threes because we had a basic ground position system, so we could find what we called a cocked hat, three different positions from the three different airplanes, and you pick the middle point. We staged out through the Azores and then on to Gander in Newfoundland, and then across Canada and the US. It was really good. That and the flying was excellent. It was really exhilarating, incredibly realistic. Good to work with the other nations, but great to demonstrate because so much of it is monitored, it's tracked, it's filmed, and to be able to demonstrate that our tactics were working and that we could get there and deliver the bombs with quite reasonable accuracy.
And what was the big debriefs like that, like for you? Because they looked quite intimidating, to be honest, from what I've seen online.
Well, they're unusual to start with. You know, you'd have 400 or 500 aircrew in the room, but we're all fairly confident. You're confident in your aeroplane, your ability, your tactics, and you'd put your point of view over. So no, they were interesting, but not intimidating.
Well, maybe we can get you back on the show for that because that's a subject all on its own, Terry. But as you can see on the side, there's some questions coming in, so I'm going to let you loose. But guys, get their questions coming in for Terry, and this will be a good one.
Okay, well, good evening, and thank you all. You've managed to spring into my mind a whole host of wonderful memories. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to start with MKMD Mike. Um, Sorry. Can I ask what it was like to be placed in the position at the thought of dropping a bomb and returning with nowhere to land? Well, funnily enough, one of my old colleagues saw the two interviews and contacted me. And he thought, as I thought, if he was going to have to do it, it would be with the thought in his mind that someone was doing it back at Marham or Larbrook or wherever. So I was damn well certain I was going to deliver my weapon on the assigned target on time. As for going back with nowhere to land, particularly in the Tornado, great short field performance. So even if it was a strip of road, we would do it. And the Buccaneer the same if that was necessary. Same. Was there much difference flying ultra low level between the land and the sea in terms of air cushioning, or was it the same? Well, the aeroplane was very stable with the big air cushion, but over land was more turbulent, so it was a little more bumpy. The Tornado, however, had a great system for taking out the turbulence and made it feel like you were sitting in an armchair, even at 100 feet and below, flashing along at 500 knots. And finally, from MKMD, did you encounter emergencies during your career? Yes, all the time. Everything from relatively simple bird strikes to an engine failure. Perhaps the one that springs to mind. Normally, with that sort of emergency, the pilot would carry out the initial actions, and you would then just check through that they've all been done through the checklist. In this case, it was one of our early sorties at Cottesmore on the Tornado. I was with an Italian pilot. We lost an engine, and actually he didn't really know what to do, and I had to talk him through it. And yeah, we made it back safely to Cottesmore. I landed, and he walked off and left me to fill out all the paperwork because he didn't think his English was good enough. Okay, the Freckle Bunny. Hi there. A Buccaneer with the Tornado style onyx and cockpit display, or simply say stuff it and just move to the Tornado. Actually, yeah, Buccaneer with Tornado avionics would have been exceptional. That extra fuel, the internal weapon carrying capacity, would have been really exceptional, no doubt about it. Zigzag Bureau of Investigation. After dropping off a nuke in a laydown drop, how much time and distance would you, the pilot, have from ground zero? Well, I hope the answer was always enough. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you what the sort of delay was. I do remember it. But the idea was that we would get as fast as we could. We would drop the weapon doing 540 knots, and we would get away from the target with just a little bit more power, maybe 600 knots if we were really lucky, and hope we would get away. We would be back end on to the detonation, so much easier to manage than being side on. The Freckle Bunny, how often was the weapons bay of the Buccaneer utilized in your day? Very often. Very often we would put practice bomb carrier in the weapons bay. The idea was that you do as much in peacetime that is the same as you would do in wartime. And I remember doing the sack bombing competition, and the Americans didn't do that. The B-52s didn't open the bomb bay. They didn't drop practice weapons. And when it came to dropping practice weapons, they would sometimes forget. We tried not to do that at all. What was it like to see the TSR-2 fly? I think in those days it was the same as seeing anything flying. I was a schoolboy, thoroughly excited by the idea of flying. The TSR-2 was an exceptional airplane, and one of the test pilots actually lived in my village, and I got to meet him both as a boy, I don't know, 14, 15 or so, and about 20 years later, when I was on the operational evaluation unit test flying at Boscombe Down, I met him then. He by then was long retired, but it was quite nice to meet one of your boyhood heroes. Okay. MKMD, what was the main reason for the Buccaneer to raise its undercarriage almost immediately after takeoff, same as any aeroplane? Huge amount of drag, and obviously the undercarriage coming up would mean that you get away from the ground that much quicker. I believe in the F-104, they actually used to select the undercarriage up and rely on what were called weight on wheel switches. These were switches that kept the undercarriage down whilst there was weight on them. Unfortunately, the Tornado had a habit, once the undercarriage came up, of dropping down very slightly. And if you had if you had the undercarriage selected up, as soon as the gear came up, the aeroplane could actually impact the runway. And we had a couple of belly up takeoffs on the Cottesmore Triple TE just before I got there.
So while we wait for a couple more questions coming in, so guys, get your questions coming in. I got a comment from one of your interviews saying that when the Tornado won the SAC competition, they took out an ad in, I think it was an aerospace magazine. Is that true? Because some general said it was terrible or something.
No, I actually have a copy of it. We didn't take it out, but the company took it out. Panavia or BAE Systems took out the ad. I wrote a couple of articles. I was the sort of PR guy. I wrote a couple of articles, and we gave lots of interviews At the time, you think back to 85, 86, we were trying to sell the Tornado to all and sundry. Um, so the more we could demonstrate that this was an incredibly capable aeroplane, the greater the likelihood there was of export sales.
And was there any consideration from the USAF to maybe buy the Tornado at the time, or was that just out the question?
No, I think the USAF did look at it before the mid 80s. I think it was, I don't know the details, but I suspect it was just not made here. The USAF is very loath to buy non-US products, aircraft, obviously. They bought the Canberra some years before, but they did have a look at the Tornado. They had a look at it in the early 80s during my time, but elected not to buy it and then developed the F-15 into the F-15E. Okay, I've got a question from the Freckle Punny, or Puny. Apologies, whichever I've got wrong there. What was the fastest you went in the Buccaneer and the Tornado, both high and low? Well, the issue on high is relatively easy. That neither of them would go desperately high. I remember being at 39,000 feet in Florida in a Buccaneer, and they asked us to climb to 41, and that was just not possible. The Tornado, the engines just wouldn't allow us to get above sort of 20, 24 maybe. In terms of speed, the Buccaneer would go, it would do just about 600 knots, 600 and a few knots, and you knew you're getting to that speed because the nose wheel door used to start to latch slightly open, and the undercarriage nose wheel red would come on and off. The Tornado, I've been supersonic at low level in the Tornado. It was one of the things you did on the first sortie out of Cottesmore, and they were clean aeroplanes. We used to go out to the North Sea and fly supersonic. And then one of my last sorties, delivering an aeroplane back to Wharton for some work. We were clean and took the opportunity to go out to the Irish Sea and do a supersonic run there. Did I go on operations in the Gulf, MKMD? No, I didn't. I had actually left the Air Force just a few months before. My squadron was the first to deploy, and I asked to go back, but was told no, they had enough people. It's a shame. It might sound a little odd, but it's one of those jobs where, and all the military is the same, you don't get a chance to prove yourself properly until you're on operations. Whereas in almost every other walk of life, you're proving yourself, you're doing the job day in, day out. What was the HUD limit in the GR1? I've read that it was 800 knots IS in the GR999 in the F3. I don't know about the F3, I'm afraid. I know they would go supersonic regularly. They would zoom climb from supersonic. We hanging stuff on the wings would limit us somewhat to about 600 plus knots, but certainly over 750 knots at low level in a clean GR1. Yep, test pilot may well have exceeded 800 knots. That would not surprise me at all. The problem with flying at those sort of speeds is that it burned a phenomenal amount of fuel. So while it might be nice to flash away from a fighter at 800 knots at low level, the question will be, have you actually got enough fuel to get back to somewhere you could land? What plane was the best to go low flying in? It would depend. Low flying on a clear day, nice day, the Buccaneer was absolutely superb. Low flying at night in lousy weather, then the Tornado, because it had the kit to do it. So it really was horses for courses. ZBI, did you ever fly over YO radar training range near Devil's Tower? Yes, I took the photograph of a Tornado GR1 near Devil's Tower. We'd been over it many times. I'd actually been to visit it on the ground on one of my days off. And we were getting airborne one day to individual sorties, and we were arriving back at the end of the sortie at about the same time somewhere near Devil's Tower. So we said, the four of us, well, why don't we join up? We'll take some photos of you. And we did, and they were great photos. And when we landed back at base, next to the authorization sheets was a message from our station commander saying, formation flying is very valuable and good training when it's properly briefed and authorized. It was an administrative bollocking. Well delivered, I thought, and he was quite right. What about Colorado or Montana, USA, and what yours? I think we've covered that. Freckleburn, I think the USAF considered the Tornado as a possible alternative. Yes, I think they did. And then as a possible Wild Weasel platform to replace the F4G. Well, that may well be the case. And certainly I looked at using F3s as they were coming to the end of their service in the Saudi Air Force, the Royal Saudi Air Force, using F3s as Wild Weasels. Was flying the Buccaneer low fun? Flying anything low is fun. Even my relatively slow microlight. Legally, I can fly at 500 feet, and it's great. Yes, it was fun. We used to get airborne. It's a serious business, but, as you're doing it day to day, and you used to get airborne thinking, my God, this is brilliant, and somebody's paying me to do this. ZBI, I used to see these USAF radar trains in the late 1980s, Douglas, Wyoming, USA. Yeah, the USAF had, whether it still does have or not, a lot of training ranges, fairly well structured, unlike the UK, where you could and still can fly low level almost anywhere. It's more structured in the US. You can fly low level, but I think you still have to be below 150 knots, which wasn't practical for a military aeroplane. So they have these quite large routes and training ranges, and the ranges use either captured Soviet Russian equipment or copied Soviet Russian equipment. So you're training against realistic threats. Yes, Spider-Man. Yes. Yes, that was another thing. Is it right the GR1 would consume 60 kilos a minute in cruise, or was it lower, higher? Ballpark figure. I've heard it was about 600 kilos a minute in full burner. If that's true, that's mad. Well, 60 kilos a minute is about right. Cruise at 420. 600 kilos a minute in full burner is way lower than it actually was. We would burn in full burner about 2,500 kilos a minute. A huge amount of fuel for an aeroplane that only carried about 7,500 kilos. But of course, you wouldn't be in full burner. We had infinitely variable burner. And if you needed full burner, then you used it. If that was the thing to stop you being shot down, then you'd use it. But you'd use it for as little time as possible. And yes, it is mad, but you're actually pouring neat aviation fuel into the exhaust and lighting it. What was life like on board the carrier? When you weren't flying, it was a bit boring, to be honest. You were fairly restricted. You can imagine it's a floating hotel, about 2,500 people. There wasn't much in the way of entertainment. We used to have film nights occasionally. There was no TV. There was no internet. And a modern carrier, everybody has their own cabin. I think two-berth cabins are the most. But everybody's got internet. We didn't have any of that. My son was born while I was away on board HMS Ark Royal, and it was 12 hours after his birth before I knew. But of course, the flying made up for that. The flying was exceptional, and some of the places we visited were pretty damn good too. What was the most sophisticated weapon you dropped or fired from the Buccaneer and the Tornado? Dumb bombs, I would say. I never dropped a laser-guided bomb. Practice with laser-guided bombs. Practice with Sidewinder, AIM-9L. But dropped 1,000-pound dumb bombs with a sophisticated modern fuse, but really quite crude, shall we say. But we used to practice for all sorts of things. It's just that as weapons get more complicated and more expensive, then it's very difficult to fire them. And if you think things like in my early Buccaneer days, Martel would cost £250,000 a shot. We didn't fire them very often. I remember in not quite 2 years with the squadron, I think we fired 2 one anti-radar, and one TV missile, and I didn't fire any of these. Okay, ZBI again. Did you target any of the thousands of ICBM sites in these areas of training? The answer is I don't know. We only dropped live weapons, and they were practice weapons, in the Nellis Ranges. All the other weapon deliveries were against what are called no-show targets, so they're just geographic points on the ground. What would happen is we would drop or mark a weapon release with a tone, and the moment the tone finished, that was the point of weapon release. We were being measured, we were being tracked, so they knew exactly where we were, exactly what height we were, exactly our position, our speed, and we provided some other data. And that would be used to calculate the weapon's impact to both the foot and the second. So we may well have targeted any of the 1,000 ICBM sites, but I certainly wouldn't know it. I suspect, though, we probably didn't. I suspect there was nothing anywhere near any of our targets. What is regarded as the worst airspace to fly in the UK, and what's the favourite place to fly? Oh, anywhere around the southeast. Whether you're flying a microlight or a Tornado, it's just incredibly congested around Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted area. And where's the best place to fly? And it's the same again, microlight, Tornado, Buccaneer. It's in the Highlands of Scotland. It's absolutely wonderful. The great benefit now is that I can flash around the Highlands of Scotland in my microlight at 1,000 feet, or maybe even a bit lower if it's not too lumpy. And I'm pretty sure I'm not going to come face to face with a Buccaneer or Tornado. There are far fewer aeroplanes using low-level, military aeroplanes using low-level airspace in the UK. Excuse me. And Spider-Man, one more before I go. When the Tornado carried alarm, could it mount them on rails usually used for AIM-9? I imagine they would be quite draggy and G-limiting. Yes and yes. Yeah, they were draggy and G-limiting. A very useful weapon. Thrown in a little bit during the first Gulf War without as much training as the guys would really have wanted. But yeah, extremely capable and used very successfully. Much better, they found, to use things like alarm from Tornado as part of their own attack package. Often when things like the Weasels went in, or when other attackers went in to hit the defenses on an airfield, it basically announced to the defenders that they were going to come under attack from something like the Tornado. So the defenses were perhaps more alert than they otherwise would have been. I know I obviously had a lot of contact with the guys during and after, and I know one 4-ship that had none of the softening up packages ahead of them, and they arrived over the target, and the Iraqis were completely and utterly surprised. Hendon Guna, good evening, sir. I really enjoyed it. That's very kind of you, and you're very welcome. As I said earlier, thank you all for bringing back these wonderful memories for me. Interview. There was a photo shoot with all the aircraft types that attended together. I believe you. Oh, was there? Sorry. No, generally not. One of the reasons is that Red Flag has this funny thing about cameras, and they did not like aircrew in particular carrying cameras, and it was to do with the proximity to Dreamland. There were other reasons for it, but they were very, very hesitant about any photography. You usually had to get security clearance to do it, and you'd probably be escorted. If you infringed some of the restricted airspace in the range, you'd be met back on the line, and any film from the head-up display, if you were foolish enough to have a camera with you, they would confiscate the whole lot. Okay, the freckle punny puny. Having seen photos of the Buccaneer being launched on the Ark Royal and Victorious at a very hang-out attack with the nose wheel in the air, was this rather hairy for the crew? I think any carrier launch is fairly hairy, particularly at night. The reason for the nose wheel in the air was getting us the angle of attack we needed. We didn't have a lot of spare power or speed coming off the catapult shot. We had the tailplane trim set at a very specific angle, all worked out beforehand. It was set in the cockpit. It was checked. If you have a look at the photographs, you can see the trim angle markings. So they were checked visually by the ground crew, and we got a thumbs up. Was it hairy? It was exhilarating. It's the best roller coaster ride you could ever imagine, except at night, particularly going off the bow catapult at night. There were a few lights around you on deck, but when you fired off the bow catapult, it all went black. And the only thing you focused on was the radar altimeter. And we watched, hopefully, the radar altimeter winding up as we climbed away. Okay, ZBI, did you hear about the Vulcan bomber that sucked up Canadian goose in the bombing range in southeastern Colorado? It had an emergency landing in Pueblo, Colorado, USA. Seen it as a beauty. No, I hadn't heard that. But I do know a tornado, and I know the crew, and I've spoken to one of them again quite recently, who sucked up a large bird at about 20,000 feet over the US and had to put down at a base in Colorado. It wasn't uncommon to hit birds. It was uncommon to hit them up at 20,000 feet. Birds were a hazard, an everyday hazard. The tornado, because of the way it was designed, the engines were perhaps slightly less tolerant than the Buccaneer's rather more crude, older technology engines of birds. But I remember once taking a bird through the nose or onto the nose of a Buccaneer, and when we landed, there was absolutely no sign of it until the ground crew opened the nose. And when they opened the nose cone, there was the bird flat on the radar antenna. And what had happened is that the nose cone was made of fiberglass. It had delaminated. The bird had gone through. The laminations had closed up again, and there was the dead bird on the antenna. How was life in RAF Germany? Any stories you can share? Oh, of course, lots of stories I can share and lots of stories I can't. Yeah, life in Germany was great. It was a little restricting at times because we had to have 70% of strike-ready crews within an hour of base, and just occasionally that would mean that you could take leave, but you couldn't leave the base. And that happened to me. It happened to a number of guys. But there were some great benefits. Like any expatriate community, we were fairly close-knit. Duty-free booze and duty-free petrol, interestingly enough, was plentiful. And we had a good time. We worked hard and we played hard. Let's put it that way. And it was nice to be able to get airborne. Germany wasn't quite as accommodating of low flying as UK. The whole of Germany wasn't available to us, and the Germans were perhaps less supportive, oddly enough, than Brits. What was my first reheat takeoff in the Tornado like? Well, it was quite special. I do remember that. It's a real kick up the backside. The acceleration was really good. And of course, my first one was at Cottesmore and a clean aeroplane. So yes, you really rattle along, thrown back into your seat, and then the aeroplane lifted off. And one of the other memories I have is we were talking, the guy I was flying with, Nye Gordon, we were talking about a fly that was, as we were starting up, this fly was on the canopy on the outside. And as we taxied, the fly stayed there. And it stayed there. And we then had this discussion about how fast we would go before the fly would disappear. And the front seat's ASI, the speed indicator, didn't start reading till 50 knots. So I used to read the speed off the inertial navigation system, and I called fly gone at 56 knots. The fly was finally whipped off by the airstream. Did I practice anti-shipping missions in the Buccaneer? Yes, the Navy's key role was anti-ship, so practiced them day and night. And it was always interesting because in wartime we didn't expect to see much in the way of civilian commercial shipping. It would be escorted, it would be in very well defined areas. In peacetime, that was not the case. They would be almost wherever they want. Now, you might think that's not a problem, except at night, you would have no way of knowing what this ship was. Sometimes we were sent off to find a military ship, and I can remember we used to drop a thing called leapus flares. So you'd run in low level, 400 feet at night, really fast. Toss maneuver, the flare would come off, it traveled not quite 3 miles or so, and they would light up 3 million candle power. And the idea was it would light up the back end of the ship, which was towing what's called a splash target. And we would then go in and bomb the splash target all at night, just training for what we had to do in war. Unfortunately, the ship we had found was a commercial vessel, now lit up like the Blackpool illuminations on steroids. But yes, we practiced anti-shipping a lot. We practiced a lot of coordinated Martel sorties. So we would fly in, people would throw 1,000-pounders at them, we would fire anti-radar Martels, and then we would aim to deliver the coup de grace with the TV-guided Martel. How often would you interact with the USAF while based in the UK? Not a huge amount. It would depend entirely on your definition of interaction. We might, out in low-flying areas, get bounced by a USAF fighter, and we would react as if it was a real fighter. That was the deal. You would carry out your reactions, even if you hadn't agreed and briefed everything with them. You would do that. Everything you saw was treated as real. For many sorties, we would arrange our own fighters. So they would be Lightnings, Phantoms, F2s, F3s. But just because it happened to be an F-15 or a flight of F-15s did not mean you would ignore it. We did work with the Lakenheath F-111s for a while on the Tornado in the early days. But it turned out they had a slightly different way of operating to us, so it didn't go too far. Okay, SPQR-77. Was Skyflash a good air-to-air missile? How did it compare to its contemporaries? You're probably asking the wrong guy. I believe Skyflash was very good. We certainly were in awe of them being able to get a Skyflash shot off at us. The 530, I don't know. The AIM-7, it would depend on the model. Our flares in the Tornado were extremely good. And I would have pitted our flares against an AIM-7. The AA-7 Apex, it down at low level. The same with all infrared guided missiles, but particularly the older generation AA-7. Things like the edges of cloud, glint from the sun would seduce it. So we were less concerned about those. The issue with the radar guided ones like Skyflash was them getting a good lock on us. And obviously we did as much as we could. And it might sound easy, and maybe today it is easy. But back in the 70s and 80s, it was not easy to get a good, solid radar lock on a target down at 100 feet and below, moving at 500 plus knots. Was any recce done from the Buccaneer on maritime sorties at all, or was it mostly done by Nimrod, MKMD? No, both. Not only Nimrod, but Shackleton as well. And on the carrier, it was our own Gannets. We would get airborne, and they would give us an air picture. So the Gannet, the Nimrod, or the Shackleton would give us an air picture. It was done in code, but relatively simple. The idea was that we would know where our target was and what everything else was around it. Sometimes we didn't have that luxury. What we'd have to do is fire a probe off ahead, a Buccaneer. We would stick together until a point, I guess, 40 or 50 miles from the target, and the probe would accelerate away. We'd know roughly where the enemy fleet was we were looking for the capital ships, and that aircraft's job was to blast in as close as it needed to identify the capital ship and tell the attacking sortie behind what the layout of the shipping was. It was always an interesting one. It wasn't exactly a suicide mission as a probe, but it was always a challenging one, not only to pick out the capital ship at a range where you still felt relatively safe. And frankly, one large grey ship looks very much like another large grey ship from about 10 or 15 miles away. But it was nice when it was done by someone else. Did you ever use the JP233 on your time on the Tornado from MK? If so, what was it like and how did it affect the Tornado's performance? I didn't actually drop it. The TOEU, when I was with it, we did a couple of trials drops. The great problem with JP233 is that it weighed 5,500 pounds. There were no dummies. So if you were ever going to be allowed to get airborne with a live one, you couldn't really land back with it. Yeah, it did affect performance. It was really quite draggy, as everything is on an aeroplane. And it had a habit when it fired, when all the submunitions fired out of it, it shook the aeroplane and would sometimes disturb our sensitive avionics. The Freckle Punny, the Buccaneer looked like it could fly through a concrete wall, a real George Foreman of a plane. Was the Tornado as robust? I don't think it was as robust, but of course it had other strengths. You couldn't really get airborne at night in a Buccaneer. Yes, we had a night roll. We would fly at 400 feet AGL. And that wasn't terrain following. We would fly a height which gave us about 400 feet AGL and not below that for the duration of that leg. And the idea was, as a singleton, you could get to the target and deliver your nuclear weapon. With the Tornado, you could fly 200 feet automatic as part of a formation of 4 or 6 or 8. And we could deliver conventional weapons relatively close together on the target and get away safely. And that was the difference. So yes, the Tornado probably wasn't as robust, but it had real strengths in other areas. Did I ever get a trip in a Phantom or a Gannet? No, I wanted to try and fly the Phantom, and it never came off. I was offered a trip in a Gannet, but I said no thanks. The thought of being in the back of a Gannet with a big radar screen, not seeing out, really didn't appeal to me, I have to say. Was the Tornado SPQR-77? Was the Tornado pretty smooth at low level with the wings back? Nope, it was very smooth. At low level with the wings back. It really was like sitting in an armchair at home, and you could flash along at 500 knots and just sit back and see the screen, see the scenery. It really was, and the wings did make a difference. The problem with the wings is that the box which carried the wing spar and the wing sweep mechanism was really quite heavy, so there was a penalty. And we often used to debate whether or not we'd actually be better off with wings fixed at 45 degrees and ignore the option of 25 or 67. Take out the wing sweep mechanism completely. We didn't have automatic wing sweep. I think the F2s and F3s did. So occasionally you had to remind blogs in the front to pull the wings back, or even less occasionally to put them forward again when we were slowing down, coming back to the circuit. Okay, there's been a few questions about weapons on the aeroplane. Perhaps if I give you a sort of a rundown on 1970s, 1980s, we didn't have precision guided weapons. The RAF got its, other than the Martel, the RAF got its first precision guided weapons with a buy of the PAVE spike system in about 81, 82. And we only got that because there'd been an underspend in the defence budget. and some civil servants went over to buy these surplus USAF kits, specified black and white TV films. Obviously didn't talk to the operators, because a black and white TV film in northern Germany, where it's generally quite murky and you try to find what are often camouflage targets in the green of the woods and the fields, was really, really difficult. But even then, it wasn't as reliable as it is today. So if you think back to that time, in order to be sure of getting one bomb on the target, you had to carry at least 4, and you had to have several aeroplanes doing it. And the other benefit of that was that the defenders then were perhaps confused. They weren't spoilt for choice, because aeroplanes would be appearing and disappearing quite quickly. But the idea was we'd saturate the defenses with aeroplanes, we'd saturate the targets with weapons, and we'd hope and expect that 1 or 2 of them would do the job. And if you think about a 1,000-pound bomb, it's got about, 450 pounds worth of high explosive in it. In 1980-81, to damage a main battle tank, you had to land that 1,000-pound bomb within 7 or 8 feet. Outside of that, yeah, you'd wring their ears. You'd give them some nosebleeds. But you probably weren't going to put them out of action. Hence the reason for dropping as many as you can. And hence the reason for things like cluster bombs, the BL-755 and the like. Which was the easiest to aerial refuel, the Buccaneer or the Tornado? Probably the Buccaneer, only because it could refuel at higher levels than the Tornado could. They were both relatively easy, and you might think, as a navigator, what do I know? Actually, I was an air refueling instructor, so I would take pilots off on their first refueling sortie. The Buccaneer had one great advantage, particularly with the Navy, in that we had our own tankers, which made it so much easier. And you would sit alert on the deck to refuel the guys as they got airborne, and then meet them on the way back and give them some more fuel. And in between, we would land, fill up, and take off again. And the same was true for the Phantoms, who manned, if you like, QRA on the deck. They would then get airborne, go chasing the bears and badgers, and we would be hanging around waiting to fill them up with fuel. We would then scuttle back to the ship, do a hot refuel, so it wouldn't shut down the engines. We'd fill up again, and we'd launch to give them more gas. MKMD, any memorable moments on QRA for entertainment or general life on the base? QRA, yeah, I can remember being in the cinema at Larbrook. We had a cinema at Larbrook, and we had 2 dedicated seats. One crew was allowed to go. You parked the van right outside the cinema. There was a telephone right by the seats, and if the phone rang and you were called back for whatever reason, you drove in as straight a line as you could. And we did that. It was great. In the dark, obviously had the lights on. The police were out straight away stopping traffic, but that didn't matter to us. We went straight across roundabouts, straight across crossroads. And when we got to QRA, the gates are open. There's a line of armed police. Probably one of the few times I was really pleased to see RAF policemen, because they weren't always as accommodating as I think they might have been. Have I ever been in a spin or the pilot lost control of the ship, sitting in the back seat, ready to eject? Well, yeah, we learned how to spin everything. The Chipmunk and the Jet Provost, when I went through pilot training, didn't spin anything swept wing. Loss of control. I was with a guy, again, I don't mention surnames, a guy called Dave. He got to show me his aerobatic sequence, and we lost control at the top, and it just did a hammerhead stall. And he just told me what was going on, and that was fine. Sitting in the back seat, ready to eject. Only once. The undercarriage wouldn't come down on a Tornado. Wouldn't come down on the emergency system either. So the plan was that we were going to go round, we burned off a bit of fuel, and we were going to do a wheels up landing. And my view on that had been, and was at the time, the aeroplanes that did wheels up landing usually broke their back right behind the navigator, right behind the cockpit section, and the navigator would get injured. So I wasn't going to hang around to wait for that to happen. As it happened, as we rolled out on finals, and I think the third go, my man had one more go on, I think it was on the right-hand side, pulling the emergency undercarriage lever, and it came down. But what happened was really nice, was that everybody was very supportive of what I said I would do. That wasn't an issue for anyone that I was prepared to eject. What's my favorite aviation-related movie? Oh, I don't know, probably Airplane, I would think. Yeah, I'm not a great fan of Top Gun. I think some of it was right. The carrier deck is probably the most dangerous place on earth, but a lot of the flying was frankly rubbish. MKMD, did you ever count air-to-air refueling on the Buck? Oh yeah, lots. I've refueled Phantoms and lots of other Buccaneers, and I've taken fuel from Buccaneers. I've also taken fuel from TriStar, even a Vulcan. And I think I said earlier I've been helping the current 27 Squadron, and I remember, and I looked it up in my logbook, I remember after we had formed, getting airborne to refuel from a Vulcan, and it still had the 27 Squadron emblem on the fin of this Vulcan. It was really nice to see. Didn't have my camera with me that day, which is a shame. It would have been nice to have taken a photograph of the 27 Squadron aeroplane. Just towards the end of my time on 27 Squadron, we just started to work with the Buccaneers from Lossiemouth, the Buccaneers in their refueling capacity. So taking fuel on tactically from a Buccaneer at low level and at night. Obviously, the Victor, a big aeroplane, the Victor was never going to come down to low level to give us fuel. But the Buccaneers were doing. Unfortunately, night low level air refueling is fraught with danger, and the other squadron at Marham lost an aeroplane and two friends of mine. They crashed into the North Sea. What did I think of the Buccaneers avionics, such as its all-weather attack radar? For the era, it was probably outdated even then. It had been designed for one purpose, and that was to find a big capital ship in the middle of the ocean. As such, it was great for finding coastlines. It was great for finding the Azores. It wasn't great for finding anything over land, anything small. And it was a real shame. It took the introduction of Sea Eagle before the Buccaneers got an inertial navigation system. And I think, as I said earlier, if you'd taken the Tornado's avionics and transplanted them into the Buccaneer, I think it would have been a marvelous aeroplane. Oliver Dennison, what are my favorite hobbies? Well, I play a lot of pickleball. My wife says I'm obsessed with pickleball. I'm just starting back to it. I've had an injury. I've been out for 6 weeks. Pickleball, for those who don't know, is life-size table tennis, if you like. Low net, badminton court size. The bats, called paddles, are rather larger than a table tennis bat. And the ball, I don't have one here. It's a wiffle ball. It's a big plastic ball with holes in it. It takes away, the way it's all designed, both the rules and the equipment, takes away an advantage from the big hitters. So you get a lot of ladies playing it, and they hold their own. It's all about control of the ball up close to the net. The ball doesn't bounce. The most the ball will bounce is 32 inches. I only found that out the other day. Doesn't matter how high you are when you drop it. So I could drop it from a Tornado at 20,000 feet, and it still wouldn't bounce more than 32 inches. And it doesn't go very fast. So it is played right up at the net, and it's about control. Chris J, did I ever get to do an Atlantic crossing in the Buck or Tornado? And any time at Goose Bay? Sadly, yes, time at Goose Bay. Yes, Atlantic crossings in the Buck and the Tornado. The Tornado, I don't think I ever did any unaccompanied. So we went with with tankers. And obviously needed tankers with the Tornado. The Buck, because it had the extra fuel, the extra range, it could fly higher, we actually did unaccompanied crossings. We flew a squadron, 9 aeroplanes, across to Red Flag. We staged. We flew them as 3-3s. And the idea was we had a rudimentary ground position indicator. And every so often, you would ask the other 2 in your formation for their position, and you'd get what's called a cocked hat, a triangle. And assuming nobody said, my kit's been all over the place, you would just pick the middle of that point as your position. And what we did is we flew from Larbrook to Largess in the Azores, and we're aiming to find a small group of islands. Fortunately, the Buccaneer had a very powerful radar, long range, 180 nautical miles or so, and it would pick up the group of islands. Obviously, if you were more than 180 miles off track, you'd have trouble. But no, we didn't lose anybody. And yes, then on to Gander. And I remember finding the coast about 150 miles sooner than I thought, and that was because it was iced. And obviously the radar didn't detect any difference between sea ice and land. We knew, I think it was the end of January time, we knew to expect that, so it wasn't a great surprise. What was interesting was because we were so poorly equipped, the air traffic system in the North Atlantic had to be closed off for us. The whole of the North Atlantic in great height bands was closed just for us, and the Air Force very kindly put a Nimrod at 40,000 feet over the top in case any of us had to go down. And what we did is we plotted the weather ships. In those days there were manned weather ships around, and you'd plot those, and if you had to, you'd try and ditch or eject close to a weather ship. If you couldn't get to a weather ship, then whatever other ship you could find locally. How do you think the Buccaneer compared to its US counterpart, the A6 Intruder? I think it was much better looking for a start. And interestingly, we had an A6 crew on 809 Naval Air Squadron, a pilot and a BN, Bombardier Navigator. They liked the Buccaneer and didn't like the kit. The A6 had better avionics than the Buccaneer did. But yes, SPQR77 says the Buck was a beauty, and I would agree. I think it was a much better looking aeroplane. Didn't carry quite as much as the A6, but I don't think that mattered that much, but did go further. Can you explain the toilet procedures on board a fast jet? Yeah, well, there aren't any. What you did is you had a pee immediately before you got in the cockpit. I think the longest I was in the cockpit was about 12 hours. Now, as I get older, of course, my bladder isn't as big, or I can't control it quite for 12 hours. In those days, I could. You had a pee immediately before you got into the cockpit. And I used to carry what's called a piddle pack. And it was a super dehydrated sponge inside a plastic bag, a bit like the Ziploc bag you'd use to put food in the freezer, except that the opening wasn't that big. The opening was maybe that big, or, if you're bragging, it's that big. And the idea was and this is not a word of a lie, you'd undo the straps and you'd undo the immersion suit and you'd pee into the bag, and then you'd tie the top and you do it all up again. I never had to do that, I'm pleased to say. And I think I decided quite early on that if I did need to pee, I'd just pee. I wasn't going to undo it. What I will tell you is a story. Again, I won't mention the guy's name. We'd been to Gibraltar for a weekend back in the 70s and 80s. There was still some tension between Spain and Britain over Gibraltar, and we used to deploy to Gibraltar every so often. It was go out on Friday and come back on Monday. We deployed a single Buccaneer. I don't know whether we were due to go as a pair, but in the end we went as a singleton. Excuse me. And we had a problem on startup, and we started the aeroplane 3 times before it all got going. And as we taxied out, my man, I had authorized this sortie. My man said to me, "We're going to have to go back. I need to pee." I said, "We are not going back. The boss will kill us if we're any later back to Larbrook. We're not going back. He said, what am I going to do? I said, I've got a couple of sick bags here. So when we get up to height, you can sort it out. And the sick bags were just a bit like airline sick bags, slightly thicker. So I put one inside the other and I passed it forward to him. And he put the autopilot in and did what he did. And then he proceeded to try and pass back to me these full sick bags. My reply was not repeatable in a public forum. I told him precisely what he could do with the sick bags and its contents. When we arrived at Larbrook, he climbed out of the cockpit and forgot them. And one of the ground crew said, "Excuse me, sir, I think that's yours and I'm not touching it." So yes, that was about as good as you could. What you did, particularly the long sorties, they would give us food and drink, but you took very little, and you had a sip when you needed it, but no more. What's the worst weather I've flown in? Oh yeah, IMC, complete cloud cover, 200 feet, 500 plus knots in a GR1, a Tornado GR1. Interestingly, some of the nearly the worst weather I flew in a microlight only a few years ago, and I've just written a piece for a magazine I learnt about flying from that, and I made the mistake of thinking the cloud or the fog would lift, and it did lift, but it never lifted very far. And as I flew into some hills into a hilly area, the cloud didn't climb, and I was getting closer and closer and closer to the ground. I was delivering an aeroplane for someone, and I was so glad when I got down, and it gave me an increased respect for the JAG guys, and perhaps a greater understanding of why we lost so many of them. Okay, well, thank you, SBQR77. MKMD, any aircrew had any embarrassing accidents while flying in your time in the RAF? Sorry, just had to ask. Yeah, I know somebody who did manage to wet the seat. I won't say who or in what type of aeroplane. Yeah, embarrassing. Yeah, both tires burst on landing. Somebody rather heavy on the boots, and the aeroplane went off. That was one of my very first sorties at Larbrook, and I thought, oh, I didn't realise the RAF did this as a way of arriving on the runway. Yeah, I mean, some of the embarrassing ones probably best not discussed. In the end, we operate under some serious stress. So yes, they may be embarrassing, but they're often embarrassing only with hindsight. And if you get away with it, if you're still alive, you can talk about it. Even if your career's over, at least you're alive. Whereas so many friends, persevered with a sortie and ended up hitting the ground and killing themselves. And that's not embarrassing, it's tragic. And no problem you asking at all. Dodgy curries and all that? Yeah, dodgy curries, dodgy kebabs in Cyprus, people having to take on oxygen. I remember a pair out of the States. I was following. We were number 2. And just about to come, having started, just about to come off the chocks, and I turned right and saw the nav on the other airplane. Suddenly his seat went right down. And a couple of minutes later, it came up again, but they'd actually started moving. And we'd had a heavy night the night before. He'd had a heavy night the night before, and he'd gone down to pull out his sick bag and throw up. What he hadn't done before then is set all the navigation kit running, so they moved with the navigation kit not properly set. It was an interesting sortie, but yeah, that was fun. And yes, you'd have the odd heavy night. A few whiffs of 100% oxygen often helped it. Loads of gear in the background. Yeah, that's my wall of shame. That from military flying days. Fave mementos you still have from flying days. Yeah, well, it's funny, isn't it? One of them really upset me a few days ago. I have a keyring. I don't have it here. I was given it by Panavia when we won the SAC bombing competition. I'd done some extra work. I won't go into it. And these were special key rings, and I've still got it. And last week I came home and can't remember where I'd been, and I didn't have the Tornado. It's a brass key ring, and it's got a brass Tornado on it. And I didn't have the Tornado. It had come off. And I was really I wasn't too bad, but I was a bit upset. I'd had this thing since 1985, and I found it on, what day are we today? Thursday. I found it on Tuesday in the back of my car. It really perked me up. It was a good day, Tuesday. I like my, you can see the Tornado there. Those of us on the early courses at Cottesmore were given one of those when you graduated. They're wood and hand carved, and obviously, although there are a lot of people who have flown Tornadoes, there aren't a huge number of those around. What else do I have? I have bits and pieces. I have a paperweight, a little paperweight, a couple of melted blades, engine blades. We had a problem at Schleswig-Holstein. I'd gone over there to do an exercise, and the ground crew were trying to sort out a problem for us and managed to pull a circuit breaker, which they were supposed to pull. It shouldn't have had any impact, but it caused the engines to wind up on the ground. The engines wound up to full reheat and disintegrated. We were very fortunate. There was a jogger that came behind the airplane just before that happened. But we got out, my man and I got out and had a look through, and you could see daylight right through the engine. And our senior engineering officer made each of us a paperweight. So, all sorts of things. I've got a starter cartridge, a brass starter cartridge from Hunter somewhere as well. Pretty impressive the Tornado could carry so much on its fuselage. Indeed, it could. Two JP233s weighed nearly 11,000 pounds. But of course, we regularly carried 8,000 pounders. So 8,000 pounds on the fuselage. The issue with ordnance like that is it impacts your performance, it impacts your range, it increases your fuel consumption, it reduces your ability to maneuver. Is oxygen really the miracle cure for a heavy night once in the cockpit then? I've heard a few aircrew saying a few draws of O really does help. Yeah, well, better than a few draws of E, I guess. Yes, it does help. But generally, we were pretty good at managing it. If you knew you were flying, you wouldn't usually have a heavy night. You'd save that for later when you knew you weren't flying, but it did occasionally happen. And yes, it is good. A couple of ibuprofen before you got in the cockpit, and then some on 100% would work wonders. But as I said, we were usually pretty sensible about it. It was just occasionally you'd get caught out. Is it true the oxygen mask had different mixture settings? Half and full oxygen. It was almost infinitely variable, and it wasn't the mask itself, it was the oxygen regulator, which I think sat in the Tornado down on the left hand side, and depending upon your altitude it would increase the amount of oxygen, and of course the great beauty was that it had a switch on it, so we could take 100% oxygen should we need it. But as you can imagine, if you sit on 100% oxygen for a great deal of time, you're certainly going to deplete your level of oxygen.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up there for that brilliant Q&A, Terry. So thanks very much for coming on, and thank you everyone who joined us and put the questions in. But Terry, what are you doing for Christmas? Are you all prepared, or are you a bit of a humbug?
Yes and no. I'm a bit of a humbug. I'm looking forward to a rest. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law's coming on Christmas Day. I had a look at the weather today. The weather does not look good, so I'm not going to be able to get any microlight flying in. So no, I'll just chill. I have agreed today to play some pickleball between Christmas and New Year. Again, having not played for a while, I want to get back up to a level of fitness fairly quickly. But I shall do some work on the aeroplane. It just needs a good clean now. We'll see relatives a little bit and see some friends.
Brilliant stuff. Well, guys, thanks very much for joining us tonight and putting your questions in. And if you haven't seen the two-part of Terry's interview, go to aircrewinterview.tv and check them out. One's on the Buck and one's on the Tornado. But yeah, Terry, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, it's been a pleasure for me. Thank you all very much. You especially, Mike, but thank everyone very much. Just thinking about this and the interview a few weeks ago just brought back so many great memories for me. So thank you all. And a happy Christmas to everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers now. Bye-bye.